Dr. Moore, following the meeting and the decision to make an award of £10 million, which we were discussing before lunch, you were, I think, involved in the mechanics of planning for the establishment of the McFarlane Trust. You had meetings with Mr. Waters and others. I'm not going to ask you about the detail of that. Do you recall, or what is your recollection of how the sum of £10 million was arrived at?
It was obviously a nice round number. We wouldn't have been extremely unlikely to get any more than that from Treasury at the time. I think that was probably about it. It's the biggest we thought we could get. It wasn't calculated per capita or anything like that.
Now, once the McFarlane Trust was established, you attended the first few of its meetings, I think. Yeah. We don't need to look at all of them, but if we just look at MACF 602_003. So this is a meeting of the trustees of the McFarlane Trust, 12th of April 1988, and we can see that you were in attendance on behalf of the department, as was Mr. Waters for the Haemophilia Society. What was your role, or the department's role, in the McFarlane Trust now that it had been set up and it had received the money?
Very little. It was simply to reassure the department that the group of people we'd put together were fit to look after public money.
And if we go to, sorry, there is one other set of minutes to take you to, MACF 602_002. These are an earlier set of minutes, 29th of March 1988. We just go to the second page. Paragraph 8, item 88.5, headed Life Insurance Mortgage Protection, reads, the chairman reported that at one of the preliminary meetings with the Secretary of State for Social Services, assistance had been promised with exploration of the above topics. Dr. Moore reported that while the AIDS unit and he were making inquiries about possible future provision, it was his view that the trustees themselves were in a position of considerable power for negotiation. It was agreed this formed the crux of the future allocation policy of the Trust, and the chairman undertook to pursue the question further with Mr. Stevens. What, if anything, can you recall about your own efforts or those of the AIDS unit to ascertain if anything could be done in relation to life insurance or mortgage protection?
I'm sorry, very little, very little.
And then if we just look further down the page under the heading allocation policy, if we pick it up at the second paragraph, it says, at the invitation of Mr. Taylor, the General Secretary of the Haemophilia Society, outlined grants made in the interim by the Society in order to ensure that the wishes of the Secretary of State were carried out by making monies available for the urgent relief of poverty. And then if we go to the next page, second paragraph, just questions arose regarding a level of equal distribution to those people with haemophilia who'd come into contact with the virus. And it was said that couldn't happen. And then if we go to the fifth paragraph on this page, just above any other business, it says, Mr. Palmer stressed the importance of looking at each case individually, and it was noted that this was the only way to meet the needs to which the Minister for Health had referred in the House on more than one occasion. Is it right to understand that the reference there to what had been said by the Minister in the House, the reference to the wishes of the Secretary of State, that this was seen by the Secretary of State as a fund which existed essentially for the provision of exceptional relief for those who could demonstrate a need related to poverty?
Yeah, I think the key word there is exceptional. I think it was intended to be welfare, so therefore it was to be distributed in accordance with a level of need rather than to be distributed sort of per capita to everybody. But I don't think that the Secretary of State specified what or defined need particularly. It was the Macfarlane Trust that I think interpreted it quite rigorously, but I think they had the capacity to have made a higher threshold, if you like.
And then your own involvement obviously ceased at the end of 1988. If I can just invite you to look at a file note from you in October 88, DHSC 0003303_005. So you'll see the date there is the 13th of October 1988 and that you're the author. And the first paragraph explains that the Minister of State for Health has asked for a note on the Macfarlane Trust and the delay in paying potential beneficiaries alleged in the Sunday Times article on the 9th of October. If we go over the page, we can see paragraph 7 says it was never intended that the £10 million should be compensation. The trust is a charity and the trust deed restricts it to providing relief for those who are in need of assistance. Can you recall if you had any involvement with the drawing up of the trust deed, or if not, who did?
Not as I recall. If it's a formal deed, it would have been done by solicitors within the department.
And then if we go down to paragraph 8, we can see that it tells us that there have been 350 applications so far, 297 payments made totalling £132,000. The largest single grant was just over £3,000. And then if we go to paragraph 11, Macfarlane Trust was established as quickly as was practicable. Our understanding is that all applications for help have been dealt with in a timely fashion. The average award of £440 reflects a cautious approach before the level of demand could be identified. Now, recognising, of course, that this is at a relatively early stage, this is October 1988, and the meeting that you'd referred to had been when the decision was taken was a year previously, or just under a year previously, November 1987. An average award of £440, nonetheless, is a pretty, it could be said, paltry, but on any view, modest sum of money, is it not, for people whose lives had been damaged in the way that you described and as having been so profoundly, movingly told to you?
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Can I then just a final question in relation, or set of questions in relation to financial provision, ask you about your involvement in discussions about extending financial provision to those infected with HIV through transfusion or organ transplant. That's an issue which, as it were, came across your desk in the course of 1988, I think.
Yes.
And if we look at DHSC 0002845_013, we can see you writing a minute on the 22nd of February 1988. It refers in paragraph 1 to a number of MPs having written seeking special financial payments for those infected with HIV by blood transfusions in line with the £10 million ex gratia payment for haemophiliacs. And there was an account of legal action being brought. If we go over the page, this is really just to place what happened next in context. The line to take us at February 1988 is described in paragraphs 9 to 12. Great sympathy for all those infected with this terrible virus. But 10, the special financial help for haemophiliacs was next gratia payment, not compensation, recognition of their wholly exceptional circumstances. And then paragraph 11, after careful consideration, we concluded that this combination of circumstances does not apply to those who unfortunately have become infected with HIV through blood transfusions. So is it right to understand that as at February 1988, when this issue crystallised through the media reports and approaches from MPs, the decision that was taken by the department was not to provide any form of equivalent payment to non-haemophiliacs?
Yeah, that's right. We stuck by the rather flaky ring fence that we'd put around the haemophiliac group.
Then I think looking at the documents, individual MPs continued to push the Secretary of State, who was still John Moore at that stage, on this issue. And there are references in the materials, which I know you've seen, to Claire Short MP and then to Robin Cook MP, raising the cases of individual constituents. And so if we look at DHSC 0003960_019, I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but this is from you, 11th of May 1988, attaching a background brief for the Secretary of State's meeting on the 16th of May with Robin Cook regarding compensation for recipients of blood infected with HIV. And if we just go to page 5, line to take, paragraphs 16 and 17, is it right to understand, Dr. Moore, that at this point in time, again, the same line was maintained, not to make payments to those who were infected through blood transfusion?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it was I was at the meeting between Claire Short and Mr. Newton, and the same line was taken there then.
Now, if we then go to DHSC 0003960_015, we have a minute from Mr. Harris, dated the 27th of June 1988. First paragraph of which says, I understand the Secretary of State has asked how financial help could be provided to recipients of HIV-infected blood and organs in a similar way to the haemophilia scheme. And then Mr. Harris sets out a number of matters. Is this right then, that although officials had advised maintaining no compensation, or sorry, no financial support, no ex gratia payments for this category of individuals, the Secretary of State wasn't entirely on side with that, wasn't entirely convinced, wanted there to be further consideration given to this issue?
He wanted, yeah, he certainly was asking us to see what could be done. I mean, I think that's partly because of the stature of Robin Cook.
And then we can see Mr. Harris here outlines in paragraph 2 two main avenues, which could be set up a new trust or extend the remit of the McFarlane Trust. And then if we go to paragraph 5, Mr. Harris says new money would be required. The £10 million given to the existing McFarlane Trust cannot in law be expended other than on its present objectives. And then Mr. Harris sets out a number of concerns about extending the scheme to include non-haemophiliacs. If we go over the page, I don't intend to go through them in detail. It culminates in paragraph 11. It says this talks about a slippery slope to a general demand to help those injured by their medical treatment. The uniqueness of haemophiliacs, paragraph 11, Paul, might be artificial, but it is important. And then it refers to the ring fencing. It was our view at the time the haemophilia ring fence was not particularly robust, and thus advised it should not be weakened further by the inclusion of other groups. And then 12, if Secretary of State wishes to proceed in spite of these problems, the next step could be to obtain Council's opinion on the legality of extending the role of the McFarlane Trust. So I think it may be right to read this as Mr. Harris essentially trying to discourage going down this route.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I would read it. It's also about the money. I don't think we could have possibly gone back to the Treasury for extra funds, given the fact that they only gave us £10 million for the haemophiliac group, somewhat reluctantly. And when they gave us that money, they were sceptical that we could hold the line anyway. So you're absolutely right. Malcolm Harris is saying don't do it.
The next document, chronologically, DHSC 0003960_010. is from you, 19th of July 1988. Paragraph 1, following Mr Harris's minute of the 27th of June setting out the problems of providing help for this group, that's the document we just looked at, Secretary of State has asked for an outline scheme to be drawn up and submitted by Thursday the 21st of July. He specified those who should benefit. I've had a first stab at an outline scheme, but would particularly welcome your view on the legality/possibility of extending the terms of the Macfarlane Trust on the clear understanding that extra funds for this new category of beneficiary would be legally required. We don't need to look at the detail of your outline scheme, but again, is it right to read the first paragraph as telling us that although Mr Harris had outlined what he thought the problems were, the Secretary of State, as there's still John Moore at this point in time, hadn't yet abandoned the idea?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely how it reads.
And then, I'm not going to go to it, but just read the reference. You got a response from the AIDS unit that reference for the transcript is DHSC 0003960_007. And then you circulated, we will go to this, at DHSC 0003960_006. You circulated a submission dated, or your minute is dated the 21st of July 1988. It says the attached submission outlines a scheme to provide special financial help in accordance with the Secretary of State's request. Consultation has been as wide as possible in the time available. Legal problems of extending the Macfarlane Trust need further inquiry. The scheme as outlined is thought to be workable for the groups which would benefit, but undermines the logical ring fence surrounding the original haemophilia scheme. Other patient groups may press for similar help. Medical colleagues and colleagues in the AIDS unit remain unhappy with the basic concept of helping this group in this special way and may be minuting their views separately. So you, I think, individually were not advocating one particular course or another. You were doing what the Secretary of State had asked, which is setting out how a scheme could work if it was introduced.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's the 21st of July 1988.
Can I just draw your attention to the written bit at the bottom of the page, where that's Alan Barton, I think, from the AIDS unit, is actually saying HS1 will now be putting up this briefing on this subject to the new Secretary of State. We are waiting to see what the new Secretary of State will do on this issue, because it was only a few days after this submission would have gone up that John Moore was removed effectively. He had been off sick for some considerable time, on and off. I think he wasn't terribly healthy, and he lost favour.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So your document was the 21st of July 1988. 25th of July, John Moore ceased to be Secretary of State for Health, and Kenneth Clarke took over as the Secretary of State for Health. And then we can see what happened then to the consideration of this option, I think, from DHSC 0002842_001. Again, this is from you, dated the 28th of July 1988. You say, I attach a draft letter for Secretary of State to send to Robin Cook regarding the above. It refers to the meetings that Robin Cook had with John Moore when John Moore was Secretary of State for Health, and talks about the scheme that was devised. And then paragraph 4 says, there's no doubt there are a few distressing cases of transfusion recipients with HIV infection in bleak circumstances who deserve sympathy, and their cause has been championed by Robin Cook. Nevertheless, it does not appear practicable to provide special financial help beyond that already provided by the social security system, and the draft letter explains this view. Whether it was as a result of a change of view on the part of the new Secretary of State or others, I don't think we have the full documentary picture available to us to share with you, Dr. Moore. But the fact is that this then went nowhere.
Yeah, that's right, yes.
And no equivalent payment was made to those who had been infected through blood transfusion with HIV.
Not at that time, no.
Just one further matter then in relation to your time at the Department of Health specifically. You were present at a meeting in July 88, DHSC 0007045_002. This is 6th of July 88. That discussed the writ that had been received in relation to a legal claim arising out of HIV infection from factor 8. I don't need to ask you about the detail of what was discussed in this meeting, but what we then see is we've got, I think, 3 different drafts of a witness statement from you. I think I'll just put up on screen one of those. If I may, DHSC 0007046_034. So this is very obviously a draft statement. If I might just read into the transcript 2 other versions we have. DHSC 0045175, we don't need to put these up, Paul, and DHSC 0023543. Just 2 questions in relation to this, Dr. Moore. First of all, is this your handwriting?
This is my handwriting. My understanding, I've completely forgotten about these till I saw them, is that I was deposed. Is that right? A solicitor, a departmental solicitor, took a statement from me, because they really are appallingly written, the first 2 drafts. This one I've tried to do my best with the corrections, because it's heavily corrected. I don't have a final draft.
No, I don't think we've located one either. You didn't, as far as I'm aware, have any further involvement with this litigation, is that right?
No.
So as far as you're concerned, do you recall if the statement was ever finalised?
I'm not sure. I don't recall. I was very unhappy with it, obviously, making all these corrections.
And in any event, the critical time period with which the litigation was concerned largely predated your appointment, and I think, as your statement, or as this draft explains, you were essentially looking back based upon your knowledge of the files and issues as they subsequently come across your desk.
Yes, that could well be.
Can I then come to the establishment of the National Directorate? If we perhaps just put your statement back up on screen, please, your statement to this inquiry, WITN 6919001. Page 7, sorry, Paul. So you've outlined in section 7 of your statement, so it's the bottom half of this page and over to the next page, the structure of the blood transfusion service prior to the establishment of the National Directorate. I think we've covered much of it in the course of your evidence this morning, the 14 different regional transfusion centres, each with individual budgets from their own regional health authority, and so on. If we go over the page, paragraph 7.3, you then refer to the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service, and you describe that as being essentially a substitute for central management. Is it right, I think, to understand from paragraph 7.3 of your statement that the Advisory Committee was just that? It was advisory, it couldn't compel or direct regional transfusion centres or regional health authorities. Yeah,
that's right. That's a little bit confusing there when it says a substitute. I agree.
So there was no central management of the blood transfusion service in England and Wales?
No.
As at the time you were involved in the Department of Health. If we just look at NHBT 0018200, this is your first regional transfusion director meeting, again, 22nd of January 1986. Can we go to page 6, and just pick up the heading NBTS Advisory Committee. It says, picking it up in the first line, NBTS members press that the department should be advised to look into central coordination of the service. The NHS Management Board will consider whether this should be an option. Haste was urged to avoid fragmentation of the service, already a most worrying and realistic prospect. So I think it's right to understand from this that as at January 1986, it was being said that some form of central coordination was something that was speedily required, and the risk was further fragmentation of the service if something was not done.
That's right, but it's probably worth putting it into a bit of context. The regional transfusion directors were concerned about the implementation of the Griffiths reforms into the transfusion service. Griffiths in 1983, I think it was, had basically suggested that general management principles should take over the way the NHS was run, so that in many areas one had committees of doctors sitting around, large numbers around the table, trying to manage services, and Griffith said, no, we should have general managers and proper management hierarchies controlling, rather than groups of doctors trying to arrive at a consensus. It wasn't just the transfusion service, this was across the NHS at the time. And general management had been introduced at regional health authorities first, and district administrators were swept away, and we got regional general managers and a management hierarchy at regions. And regions were then looking throughout their patch to see whether there were other organisations that could similarly have general management introduced. So that was what the NHS Management Board was doing, applying the Griffiths criteria. Now, what the regional transfusion directors feared was that they would be Griffithised, so that their responsibility as doctors and in charge of the service would disappear, and they would have general managers either over them, reporting in a different way, and that their freedom of action as regional transfusion directors and acting together as a group would be undermined by the general managers. I mean, particularly leading the charge on this was, as I recall, Southwest Thames, Dr. Keith Rogers. He was due to retire, and he was facing the threat of having a general manager put over him. And regional transfusion directors were particularly concerned, as it says here, about the legal implications of this, who was going to be clinically responsible, and so on and so forth. I mean, in fact, it's a recipe that's worked perfectly well as throughout the health service. There's been managers and doctors working together fine, but at this particular point in time, it was new, and they feared it. So we're talking about this urgency and worrying and realistic. It's worrying from a transfusion director's point of view, I think, rather than we wouldn't have thought it was particularly worrying, I don't think, within the department.
But the step was taken to undertake effectively a root and branch structural review of the way in which the BTS was organised in England and Wales. That
was a way of getting out of this dilemma. If the regional transfusion directors would have been quite happy to report to one general manager rather than have 14 general managers over all of them. They also saw advantage in having one source of finance rather than each of them having to plead their case to 14 regional health authorities.
We'll look at the management review in a moment, the organisational study that was produced. But bearing in mind, this is January 1986. It is then almost 3 years before the National Directorate itself is established. Is that right? And in that period of time, prior to the establishment of the National Directorate, was there any mechanism for resolving disagreements or differences of approach between regional transfusion centres and their directors or the health authorities, other than the role of the advisory committee?
There would have been a clinical route through the consultant advisor talking to the DCMO, that would be Ed Harris, and Ed Harris had links with the chief regional medical officers. So there was a route at a clinical level to actually make things happen. Otherwise, as I explained earlier, it was the letters to the regional general manager.
But essentially, if there were disagreements or differences of approach between regional transfusion directors, they were ultimately entitled to run their fiefdoms, which is how it's been described by others, as they wanted to.
They were entitled to, but they rarely did. The way that the regional transfusion directors were, their meeting was a very, very effective meeting. I mean, it went on, I think the last meeting they had was the 210th, and no meeting lasts that long if it's not actually producing something effective. Their way of working was to set up working groups on a particular issue. So if there was a divergence of opinion, they would set up a working group. The working group would report back to the transfusion directors, and they would, as far as I know, always stick with the verdict of the working group. It was a very, very effective way of working.
Was there any specific source of guidance or advice available to regional transfusion directors on issues relating to virological threats? You think already made the point that RTDs were not virologists.
Yeah, they would have had access to the deliberations of the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, for example. They would have had virologists. Virologists were employed in the transfusion centres, so they would have had their own in-house knowledge, and of course they were well connected with the world of transfusion medicine, so they would have known what was going on elsewhere.
If we then pick up the study produced by NHS Management Consultancy Services at CBLA 0002392. So we can see this study was produced in October of 1987. If we go to page 5, under the heading Synopsis, we see in paragraph 1 it says the study was commissioned against the backcloth of, and then point 1 is self-sufficiency, 2, imbalance between supply and demand, 3, the recognition that the National Blood Transfusion Service is in reality a loosely federated collection of regional transfusion centres. And then paragraph 2, our examination and discussions lead us to conclude that nationally there's an adequate supply of blood available or potentially available to meet the dual demands of the plasma requirement and hospital needs for the present and foreseeable future. The major question to be addressed is therefore whether the BTS is organised in the best way to maximise the available potential. We've discovered wide variations in policy, procedures and functions between the regional transfusion centres with no real evaluation of performance and little effective coordination either between the regional centres or between the centres and CBLA. And then 4, underlying problems identified, absence of reliable management information, inability of 2 London regions to meet the needs of their hospitals, absence of coordination between individual RTCs, and also between the BTS and CBLA, and then apparent inefficiencies. Sorry, can we just go up the page? Apparent inefficiencies both within and between individual RTCs. Now, before we look at what was proposed as a replacement, broadly speaking, were those conclusions accepted by regional transfusion directors and by the Department of Health?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And then if we go on the page that we're on, paragraph 5, there's a suggestion of 3 options available for the future of the BTS. One is introduction of reliable management information, and then 2 is raising the profile of existing Regional Transfusion Directors Committee and the Advisory Committee, introducing a new coordinating committee. The 3rd is the creation of a special health authority to centrally manage and fund the BTS. And then, top of the next page, there's essentially a 4th option, a composite approach, to install the information system and establish the RTC/CBLA coordinating committee. And it's right, I think, that the Department of Health chose a version of the 4th option, which became the National Directorate.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Were you involved in the decision-making as to which option to choose?
Yes.
And can you recall, in broad terms, why that option was the one that the department opted for?
Well, the management, the first option, the management information system, and then just let it all happen, that didn't seem to have enough direction behind it. It could have taken years to get anywhere. The option of a special health authority, which was probably the option which would have addressed all the issues, would have taken a long time. It could have taken setting up a special health authority from scratch. All the negotiations with the regions and all the rest of it would probably have taken 18 months before anything happened at all. So some sort of halfway house did actually seem to be the best option. So that's what we went for: management information system, some sort of central control outside the department but within the NHS, and recognise that that was actually an interim option. We wouldn't have expected that to last for very long, but it would give the department and the service a chance to, with a management information system, find out what needed to be done and work through to the next stage. So it was very much an interim option.
And we can see that interim option being announced in July 88, so RLIT 40794. This is Edwina Curry's announcement, 28th of July 1988. We've decided the new management arrangements are needed for the super-regional and national dimension of the National Blood Transfusion Service. We intend that operational responsibility at the national level for the Nbts and the Central Blood Laboratories Authority will be exercised on behalf of Health Ministers for England and Wales by the NHS Management Board and undertaken by its Director of Operations in consultation in respect of Wales with the Director NHS Wales. Day-to-day implementation of the national strategy will be delegated to a new National Director of NBTS and a small supporting staff. And then there are 4 key objectives identified: implement a cost-effective strategy for ensuring an adequate supply of blood throughout England and Wales, implement a cost-effective strategy for the supply of plasma to BPL, coordinate the activities of the NBTS and the CBLA, promote the efficiency of the NBTS. So, the new National Director referred to there was Dr. Gunson. The small supporting staff, which included you then as Deputy Director, essentially operated out of the, was it the Regional Health Authority's premises in Manchester? Yeah. And it really was, I think, a very small staff. It was half a dozen or so. Yes. Yeah. And then, is this right, that the National Directorate which had no specific legal status, it wasn't a new body as such, was it, reported to the NHS Management Board?
Yeah. We reported through their Director of Performance Management, which was Mr. Graham Hart.
May I just ask, if this was an interim measure, why didn't it say so? Why did no one appear to say so in this announcement?
I don't know.
Do you know?
No, I don't know. It isn't. I mean, it clearly was an interim measure because one could tell subsequently only a couple of years after we'd been established, we put proposals back to the department for taking it further. And the management report itself clearly indicates that this option isn't going to tick all the boxes because it doesn't have control of the finance. And without control of the finance, you're severely limited as to how far you can go.
I mean, would there have been a problem for running the service if what had been said had been, well, we're going to go with option 3, it'll take some time, so in the interim we'll do this?
No, I don't think so. I think we certainly wouldn't have wanted to commit to option 3 because that was actually the option of having a special health authority just for the 14, and that fell by the wayside some years later anyway. I can't see any penalty attached to putting as a first step or something into this statement. It just wasn't done.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, this therefore was an attempt at having a nationally coordinated blood transfusion service covering England and Wales. Is there any reason in particular why that isn't something that could have been done years earlier if those involved had been so minded?
No, I can't think so. It wouldn't have been. One would have not been able to do it at the height of the AIDS problems. So I wouldn't have thought one could have done it before 86 anyway. I mean, 84, 85 were very, very fraught years trying to maintain the safety of the blood supply. So one could only have started thinking about it in 86. In fact, it was thought about in 86. It took a year to do the survey. So that brings us up to roughly when it happened. So unless we're talking way before AIDS in the early 80s, when I suppose it could have been done then but wasn't.
And just so that those listening are clear, the reason that the establishment of the National Directorate didn't resolve the funding issue is that the funding position remained as it currently was, with regional health authorities supplying funding on a regional basis to the regional transfusion centre.
That is correct. But as you might want to go on to later, the funding position actually got worse after the NHS and Community Care Act.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, but we can deal with that now.
Okay.
And why was that the position?
Well, it was the NHS and Community Care Act 1990, the loosely referred to as the purchaser-provider split. So the purchasers were given funding. So the money that the regional health authorities had in the past, they gave to district health authorities. So that made the situation far worse for transfusion centres because instead of getting one amount of money from the regional health authorities, they then had to trade effectively with multiple district health authorities within their patch. So from 1990, the situation became very, very difficult for RTCs.
And that position, I think, remained the position for your remaining time as Deputy National Director. We know after that the National Blood Authority was eventually established. Now, in terms of your own roles as Deputy National Director, I think you told us earlier that you were deputised for Dr. Gunson, but not in relation to matters of medical clinical judgment. Did the fact that you were not a clinician mean that you did not feel able to question or debate decisions or judgments made by Dr. Gunson?
I wouldn't have debated, well, I would have debated but deferred to any clinical judgment of Dr. Gunson. We would talk about everything else though.
Now, your roles included coordination of plasma supply. I'll come on to a couple of aspects of that. You've described that in some detail in your written statement. If we just look briefly at NHBT 00181888, please. This is what turned out to be the last meeting of Regional Transfusion Directors, their meeting on the 18th of January 1989. If we go to the second page, we can see there's a heading, Communications with the Directorate, just over halfway down the page. And then towards the bottom of the page, Dr. Gunson reported the establishment of the National Management Committee. I'll come on to that in a moment. If we go to the next page, about two-thirds of the way through that long first paragraph, there's a discussion about how contact is going to be maintained if RTD meetings no longer take place. And so there's a sentence beginning, Dr. Gunson confirmed that contact with the Snbts. Can you just highlight the rest of that paragraph, Paul, if you can find it? It's about 12 lines down. Yeah, can we just highlight the rest of that paragraph? Just slightly easier to read that way. Okay, so we have Dr. Gunson saying contact with Snbts will be maintained through meetings between Gunson and Cash. Dr. Pickles confirmed the DOH accepted the changes. Dr. Gunson confirmed 3 avenues of communication with the department which will be maintained. Direct contact between himself, so that's Dr. Gunson and Dr. Pickles, and between Dr. Moore and Dr. Canavan. And then there's going to be coordination via the NHS Management Board and through an annual report. What was the specific contact between you and Mr. Canavan, and who was Mr. Canavan? What was his role?
Mr. John Canavan, he took over from me as HS1. So he was effectively doing my old job. So it was to both our advantages to keep in touch, me to keep in touch with the department and him to keep in touch with the transfusion service. So we were quite close.
Now, the National Management Committee, which Dr. Gunson referred to, if we just look at a couple of minutes, first of all, NHBT 0118864_012, please. I think. NHBT 0118864, that's 64, yes, that's it. So this is the first meeting of the Management Committee. This is the National Directorates Management Committee. What was the function of the Management Committee?
Wow, well, it was the senior committee of the National Directorate. Its job was to ensure that all the functions set out in the job description of the National Directorate were actually carried out. You know, the coordination, the coordination of the plasma supply, and so on and so forth.
And if we go over the page, we can see, first of all, just about a third of the way down the page, there's reference to the Nbts/CBLA Liaison Committee. So I just want to understand what the previous set of committees ended up being replaced with. So we had the National Directorate. The National Directorate had its own management committee, meeting for the first time here. And then the blood transfusion service would have regular meetings with the CBLA through this liaison committee, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the Directorate hosted the Nbts CBLA liaison committee, so it was one of our subcommittees. So that was to replace it previously. Dr. Lane or staff from CBLA had actually sat on the Regional Transfusion Directors Committee, and that wasn't always effective. By having a liaison committee that met regularly, we were able to meet with, we usually met with 3 or 4 staff, the Chief Executive, the Finance Manager and so on, from CBLA. And Dr. Gunson and myself and other transfusion directors would then be able to talk directly to the people who mattered at CBLA, which was a vast improvement on what had happened previously.
And then if we look at the very bottom of this page, we've got the heading, oh no, I'm sorry, my apologies, should we go to page 4? Bottom of page 4, we have the heading Management Information Systems, and if we go to the next page, we can see reference there to a steering group chaired by you and with a number of others attending. What was the function of that particular steering group?
Well, the management information system was to be installed in every single regional transfusion centre. We weren't at the Directorate able to identify all the things that needed to be measured within regional transfusion centres. Neither were we able to suggest how the whole process should be implemented. So what we eventually ended up doing, we invited a company, I think we invited Ernst Young, to install the systems for us. The object of this group was actually, first of all, we had a beauty parade of companies that might have been able to install the system. So we picked the one that we thought was best. And then they went round to the transfusion centres and got their views on what needed to be measured and how it could be installed. And then it came back to this group to try and pull the whole thing together. So it was exactly that. It was a steering group to make sure that we had a management information system that everyone was happy with.
And I don't think we need to go into the details of the management information system set out in a number of the documents that you've referred to in your statement. But is this right? When we're talking about a management information system, we're not talking about the compilation or maintenance of data relating to donations.
No, absolutely not. But it's almost everything except that.
And I'll come on to ask you a little about record keeping in relation to donors and donations in a few minutes. We then see reference to, under the heading Donor Recruitment Publicity, your intention to create a provision of donors committee to supersede the DHSS Publicity Committee, chaired by you, and would be representatives from the regional transfusion centres. Does it follow from that the question of donor recruitment, donor publicity effectively was taken out of the hands of the Department of Health by the establishment of this replacement committee?
Yes.
And so it became something which the National Directorate did?
The National Directorate did it, but we still expected the department to pay for it. So we did have a representative of COI on the committee.
And then, if I can ask you about 2 specific issues that arose in the course of a couple of later National Management Committee meetings. The first is at NHBT 00718004. So this is the National Management Committee's meeting, February 1991. The specific issue I wanted to ask you about, well, in fact, I think there were probably 2. The first is regional transfusion committees. Now, we've heard some evidence in the inquiry about the establishment of regional transfusion committees and hospital transfusion committees. We just look at the bottom half of this page. It says the committee discussed the findings of Dr. Gunston's survey of regional transfusion committees and the need to make progress in the introduction of medical audit in the Nbts. At present, 8 regions do not have a regional transfusion committee. It was recognised the foundations for medical audit in the Nbts are hospital transfusion committees. It's essential that they should be in place and working as soon as possible. And then there's an agreement that Dr. Gunston will write to regional medical officers in relation to this. And then reference to a sum being allocated for the introduction of medical audit. Now, that's not that's across the NHS, that sum, isn't it? It's not nothing to do specifically with RTCs. Hence the reference to RTDs needing to bid to RHAs to have a share of those funds. And then if we go to the last page of this document, we can see there, I don't propose to go through the detail of it, but this is a summary of Dr. Gunston's survey of regional transfusion centres, assessing their enthusiasm or lack of it for the establishment of regional transfusion committees. Without going through the detail of it, was this an issue upon which you had any involvement as far as you can recall?
No, not at all. No.
So you don't know what, if any, further steps were taken to try and resolve this? No. And then the other management committee meeting I wanted to ask you to look at is NHBT 40191_144. So this is the 16th of April of 1991. If we just look at the bottom of the page, we've got the heading Plans to Create Medical Audit Teams. It was agreed that in line with previous decisions of the committee, plans should now be laid for the introduction of medical audit in the Nbts. These medical audits will examine the medical work of medical staff within RTCs only, and then it says a list of consultants who will conduct the audits will be drawn up by Dr. Gunston. So, again, is it right to understand that it's sometime after April 1991 that this process of medical audits, clinical audits commences?
Yeah, certainly.
But was that part of the overall move towards improving qualities and standards within the blood transfusion service that was one of the overall objectives of the National Directorate?
It would have been. I mean, it was a departmental policy to introduce medical audit, and it would naturally have been part of the Directorate's work, particularly Dr. Gunston, to actually coordinate that activity.
And then if we go to the bottom of the next page, we've got the heading Budget Devolution. Members reported that the chief difficulty in budget devolution so far encountered was the lack of uniformity and consistency in the approach by RHAs. Since treasurers have developed their own policies, some RTCs have received development funds for anti-HCV testing, others have not. Some RTCs have included a service element in the cost of their products, others not. Consequently, the variation in the value attached to products is considerable. And then there's a further discussion top of the next page I don't think we need to look at. So, leaving aside the complications that you've already referred to, created by the passing of the National Health Service and Community Care Act 1990, did the establishment of the National Directorate improve the funding situation in any respect whatsoever for regional transfusion centres?
Yes, it did, because we coordinated a common costing system. So part of the information that we got from the management information system enabled a cost to be put on products, i.e. how many staff were involved in the manufacture of a particular product, and how long it took and so on, what the reagents cost, and all that sort of information enabled transfusion centres to put a value on the product they were making. And once they'd got the value, they needed to know how much money they needed to recoup from the district or regions in order to balance the books. So that was very much an initiative brokered by the National Directorate, and that was welcomed by transfusion centres because it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Now, you told us earlier about the move to cross-charging or cross-accounting. I don't think we need to look at the underlying documentation in relation to it. Broadly speaking, what, to your mind, was the major advantage or advantages of changing from the pro-rata system to the cross-charging or cross-accounting system?
Well, the main advantage was that it enabled regions that didn't really have a great need for a blood product to nevertheless provide their regional quota of plasma and get paid for it by the blood products laboratory. So it freed up a lot of resource to increase the plasma supply in a very effective way. I mean, that was really the main reason.
Again, is there any particular reason why that could not have been introduced at an earlier stage?
Probably not. In fact, I think it was considered a year before in one shape or form.
One further committee is the Nbts Snbts Liaison Committee. If we can look at NHBT 40189_173. So we can see this is recorded as being the minutes of the first meeting of the above committee held at the National Directorate, 27th of June 1990. It's a small attendance. You and Dr. Gunson, there presumably representing NBTS, Dr. Cash, Dr. McIntosh representing SNBTS. What was the purpose of this committee, and was this a new initiative?
Yes, I think at the outset, I mean, this is 1990, the Directorate had already been running for 18 months before then. Initially, Dr. Gunson and Dr. Cash met, both being directors of their respective BTS directorates, as it were. But then Mr. David McIntosh was appointed. I think his role was a general manager at SNBTS, so he was interested in issues more or less the same as my own. So it made sense then to have a more complete meeting between ourselves and SNBTS, where David McIntosh and myself could talk about our topics, and Dr. Gunson and Dr. Cash could talk about the others.
Now, I asked you earlier about the extent to which you had dealings with Scottish colleagues when you were in HS1A. Once you were at the National Directorate, did you have any particular dealings with, or was there any mechanism for liaison with colleagues in Scotland other than through this liaison committee or through the meetings which Dr. Gunson and Professor Cash would have?
No, quite considerably. I mean, I dealt directly with Murray Thornton, I think, who was in charge of their donor recruitment in Scotland. She and I would liaise frequently. I dealt directly with a gentleman whose name I can't remember, who was in charge of quality assurance up in Scotland, and David and I would talk about other matters as they arose.
What about Wales? Because the National Directorate encompassed both England and Wales.
Yeah, well, we saw Wales with Dr. Tony Napier. I deal directly with him, and that was very much just a large transfusion centre. It didn't have the national. I mean, the thing about Scotland, it covered lots of transfusion centres within Scotland, whereas Wales was just Cardiff.
And what about Northern Ireland? Was there ever much of a interaction with or liaison between the National Directorate and Northern Ireland?
We had a representative from Northern Ireland who sat on part of the Provision of Donors Committee, but mostly on operational matters. They were more closely linked with Scotland than they were to us.
And then if we can look at the second page of this document, you'll see the heading, I hope, HCV test, paragraph 3.2.1. I just want to draw your attention, Dr. Moore, to one sentence, which I'm going to ask you about in a few minutes. Halfway down that paragraph, it says the policy on introduction of HCV, I mean the HCV testing, will be a DH decision, but the actual date of implementation will be for UK BTS to decide. So that I don't have to come back to this document, I'm just showing you that. What I wanted to ask you about, though, is the next paragraph, 3.2.2, which is headed Look-Back Programmes for HCV. It was agreed that whilst tests and policies are evolving, it would not be appropriate to establish a look-back policy, and that ACVSB, that's the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, should take a view in due course. It was noted that France have a comprehensive look-back programme. Now, during your time at the National Directorate, once the HCV testing was introduced nationally in autumn of 1991, was any further consideration given by the National Directorate to look back being undertaken?
Not that I knew.
And do you know why? That may be an impossible question to answer.
I really don't know. And I'm not saying it wasn't. I mean, it's quite possible that Dr. Gunson was talking with medical colleagues about such a programme and I didn't know about it.
Now, the topic I want to ask you about next is about hepatitis C screening and the introduction of hepatitis C screening. As I understand your statement, Dr. Moore, I think it's borne out by the documents, this wasn't an issue in which you had a particularly close involvement.
That is correct.
But what we saw from that document that we were looking at a few moments ago, it's recorded as being a decision for the Department of Health. So the introduction of hepatitis C screening, a decision for the Department of Health. Why was it seen as a decision for the Department of Health? Do you know?
I think it would have been a matter of policy at a level where one would have expected the Department of Health to know. They would have wanted to inform ministers. If it's something that one needed to inform ministers about, then it's something for the Department of Health. There was a cost attached to it, which again would involve the Department of Health. It was a decision that needed the support of virologists. It would certainly needed the support of the ACVSB, which was a departmental committee. So I think all that kind of points to the fact that at the end of the day, it would be a DH decision.
Would it be right, however, to understand that there'd be no impediment to an individual regional transfusion centre if it wanted to and if it had the funding and agreement of its regional health authority, introducing hepatitis C testing on its own initiative?
I mean, that's actually a complicated question. If the question is impediment, could it be done, then the answer is yes, it could. If an RHA decided to fund for that purpose, there would probably be nothing to stop it. Would it be a good thing to do is another question, and my answer to that would probably be that it wouldn't be.
I just want to pick up on that latter point. You'll know from the material that you've seen, and it may be a matter that you recorded in any event, that there was one regional transfusion centre under the directorship of Dr. Lloyd, which did start testing a few months earlier than the rest of the centres in the service. We know the views expressed by some individuals in relation to that. Did you or the National Directorate have a view or a position as to whether that was something that was appropriate for Dr. Lloyd to have done?
I mean, I think I would just like to, before answering that, clarify the understanding of when exactly Dr. Lloyd introduced HCV testing in Northern. According to some papers that you gave me, written by Dr. Gunson, it was mid-April. Are we talking 91 or 90?
It's 1991.
1991. He says mid-April, and then there's two other documents, one from Dr. Lloyd in May, 2nd of May, saying that he's going to start it in July, and then there's another letter on the 24th of June, I think, where he's apologising to Dr. Gunson for the way he went about it. My recollection is that it is, as Dr. Gunson said in his written, that it was that Dr. Lloyd did actually start it in the middle of April.
We'll be able to clarify that with Dr. Lloyd because we have the advantage of hearing from him.
But I think it is actually important because my understanding is that there were concerns at that time in April about the status of the test, that there was a second generation test, and there were some doubts as to quite how good it was. So April would have been a difficult time. There would have been testing concerns about its introduction then, which wouldn't necessarily have been the case at the beginning of July. So that's kind of important. And then the other question I think I referred to in my statement is about the way Dr. Lloyd went about it.
If we go to PRSC 0002858, these are Dr. Cash's notes, as I understand it, of an Nbts SNBTS meeting 7th of January 1991. And there's reference to you, for example, at paragraph 3. If we go over the page, you'll see the heading HCV donation testing. HG, that's Dr. Gunson, conveyed his concern that DOH has still not decided on a start date. It now seemed probable that May, June 1991 would be the earliest possible. 2, HG advised that he believed the major problem for DOH was mechanisms for finding the money for NBTS RTCs and for E/W confirmation testing. The issue was one of DOH's disinclination to fund centrally and insist on cross-charging. And then paragraph 3 records Professor Cash requesting a more definitive operational description for start date. Now, what I wanted to ask you about is the point recorded there at 2. It's recorded there by Dr. Cash that Dr. Gunson saying the major problem for the department was finding the money and funding confirmation testing. We know that, I think not long after this, the Department of Health said it wasn't going to fund it and it was left to regional health authorities to do so. But do you recall any particular discussions about how HCV testing was going to be funded?
Yeah, I do. I think earlier in the year, Dr. Gunson had asked all regional transfusion directors by which date could they start testing. And the transfusion directors gave various dates, but quite a lot of them said, oh, they could only do it provided they had the money, or they'd only do it if they had the money. We understood that to be pretty standard response because they come to us say we need the money, then I would go to the department and say they can only do it if they get the money, and then there was a chance that the department might say, fine, here's another X million pounds, get on with it. It was worth asking. I certainly never thought it was likely to be an impediment to the start of testing, and this actually surprises me because I doubt whether Dr. Gunson thought it. It was a try on. We went to the department. The department said no, and so the money was we simply effectively put up the price of blood to the districts to cover the cost of the extra testing. So it wasn't actually a factor. So it does surprise me that it's put down there as a major problem. I never saw it as such.
Do you have any recollection of what the department's reasoning was for its rejection of the National Directorate's request for the department to fund the cost of the testing?
Well, the department simply said, get on with it. You've got a mechanism for charging your customers. Simply put the price up. Why? There's always a demand for central funds, the funds that the department holds specifically for a purpose. If there's another method of funding it without dipping into that, go and do it. I can hear them saying it.
Now, it's, as I said earlier, and as you know, it's autumn of 1991 when, leaving aside Dr. Lloyd's earlier introduction, that the anti-HCV screening is introduced across the board. I don't know whether you have any views, Dr. Moore, informed by your experiences at the time, as to whether that could or should have been done sooner. Certainly, other witnesses have expressed a view that it might be said to have taken too long to get to that point. Do you have any observations on that, based upon your own experiences?
My own observation would be simply to note what Dr. Gunson said, that he himself thought it could have been introduced maybe 2 months earlier. Maybe the July date would have been doable. As far as the rest of it goes, my judgment is not as good as that of the ACVSB and the committees that were actually deciding. I would defer to their judgment.
I'd asked you earlier if you'd had any involvement beyond that very limited involvement we saw in the HIV haemophilia litigation. There was a later litigation against the National Blood Authority on the issues of surrogate testing and anti-HCV testing, and the question of whether it should have been introduced earlier. And we know Dr. Gunson gave evidence in that case. I'm not going to trouble you with the detail. Were you ever approached for a statement or asked to be involved in that litigation?
Not that litigation, no. I was asked whether I had anything to add for the Penrose inquiry. And I think they said particular areas that I might have been, and I said no. Dr. Gunson was in charge of that.
Then the litigation I've just referred to was essentially not based on a negligence claim, but product liability. You will have seen in the materials that were provided to you, Dr. Moore, some discussions whilst you were still at the department about the department giving advice and guidance to regional transfusion centres about the implications of the new consumer protection legislation. I think you were given over lunch a copy of a report which you wrote about product liability. I don't think we need to go through the details of it. I can read the references out, if I can find the right references, into the transcript. So it was discussed at a meeting June 1987 of the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service. Paul, we don't need to put this up on screen, it's just for the transcript, BPLL 0007202. It's discussed at a meeting in July 87, CBLA 0002383. And then you produced a report in September 1987, BPLL 0010118. The question I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Moore, having had, I hope, your memory refreshed by looking at those materials, was was the question of introducing hepatitis C screening or indeed introducing surrogate testing in some form or another, was that viewed through the prism of the product liability legislation in terms of your own involvement, as far as you can recall? No,
not at the time, I don't think so. I mean, those papers that you referred to, basically, I am in that paper paraphrasing work by Mr. Nudick of Reading University, and he wrote a critique of how the new legislation might apply to pharmaceuticals, and part of my brief at the department was hospital pharmacy, so I had got that critique from him, and then I was asked by the Transfusion Service what it meant and could I find out, and I arranged for Dr. Newdick to come up from Reading and talk to a group of Transfusion Service staff. I think it was at North West Thames. It was for Dr. Contreras. In fact, at the end of the day, he couldn't come, but he briefed me, and I did it on his behalf. So that's what those papers were for. It was done. It didn't have much more detail than he had actually put in there. It was very much, you know, this is what it might mean. These might be the defences, but you know, we have to see when there's some case law.
So, again, is it right to understand, as far as you can recall, that when either the department, during your time there, in relation to any consideration being given to surrogate testing, or the National Directorate was looking at introduction of anti-hepatitis C screening, minds were not explicitly focused upon whether this was something that was required by the consumer protection legislation?
Not specifically, although it was involved. I think we knew it was one of the reasons for us acting together as a service across the UK was that the development risk defence, or the state-of-the-art defence in the product liability legislation, we thought that those defences would apply or could apply if we acted as one, and that could be perceived as the state of the art. So that was to all our advantages to act together as one. So to that extent, we were aware when introducing the HCV test that it did have some bearing on our product liability.
So I've probably got about another 20 minutes worth of questions for Dr. Moore or myself, and obviously we also need to give an opportunity to call participants to suggest any further questions. Bearing in mind that Dr. Moore's been back giving evidence since 2, would it be sensible to have perhaps a shorter break now?
And then what? We have 20 minutes and then we have another break.
And then we have another break, but both breaks can be used by call participants to indicate whether they have any further questions.
Well, as long as the call participants who are listening understand that they can certainly you can field questions from them now, as well as later, yes. So we'll take a 20-minute break, shall we? And that means coming back actually at quarter to 4.
Thank you, sir.
Right.